I think it's time to start. Hey guys, this is Luke Johnson, and I'm joined by Dr. Lindsay O'Connor. We're going to be talking about a really incredible short story. It's called The Fall of the House of Usher by Poe. And I don't know, Lindsay's just going to teach me, so I'm going to let her structure it the way she wants to structure it.
Great. Well, I think we should start at the beginning. So I like to read the first paragraph closely, which I won't read aloud, but I think we could probably cover a lot of ground if we just talk about what happens in the first paragraph. So I asked Luke to read the first few paragraphs particularly closely to prepare for this. So
you know what I did end up doing instead is I went and just read the whole thing. So
but do you as one should do. But,
right?
Yeah.
Do you think it would be worthwhile to clue the audience in on the entire arc of the story, or do you want to use the first paragraph to introduce the entire story?
Option 2, because I think why I like to focus on the first paragraph is, sort of by way of introduction, and I think like if we can take our audience through the story in the way the order in which you encounter all of the events, I think that will be helpful.
Sure.
So what I will do, I guess, is just maybe sort of summarize the first paragraph.
Sure, go for it.
So the first paragraph is rather long. We have our narrator, who's narrating in first person, telling us that during a dull, dark, and soundless, quote, day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, right? So it's autumn, it's dark, it's cloudy. He is on horseback, and he's in a singularly dreary tract of country. He finds himself, as the shades of evening are drawing on, so the sun is setting, and it is now evening. It's autumn, it's evening, it's cloudy. He's in a particularly dreary place. He finds himself within view of the, quote, melancholy house of Usher. So this is how, I think that's all basically the first sentence. This is how he introduces the eponymous house to us, right? So before we even get to the house, it's autumn, it's cloudy, it's dark. The mood is already being set here, right? And then the house is described as melancholy. And he goes on very quickly.
Is it not strange to call a house melancholy? Why? Maybe we should say something about why that's strange to call a house melancholy. Because typically, melancholia is something that is ascribed to an individual, right? Now, is there something person-like about this house, or maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be. We'll certainly talk about the house and the people, but I want to just go through like step by step here,
sure.
Because I think at this point, I would, if that's all I've read, I would never think the house is a person. Okay. You know, like I think in sentence 1, I don't know that I would necessarily jump to that.
Sure,
right?
Of course.
You might think, okay, melancholy, it's usually people. But something else that's happening here is like there's so much going on with mood, and there's so much going on with like the setting being the thing that creates mood in this particular story, in this particular place. And so he goes on to say, I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. And so he goes on throughout this paragraph to talk about how he doesn't know why, but like just being in the presence of this house makes him feel really creeped out. So it's dark, this insufferable gloom, as in like he's never going to get over it, like he doesn't see a way out of this feeling of gloom, right? So from sentence 2, the house and the place and the land where it is, the weather, all of that is causing this sense of gloom, and he knows it. Like he's like, I don't understand why this is happening, but everything is making me feel like ridiculously gloomy and scared and sad. So he's aware that like something odd is going on, right? Like he says like, I don't understand why this is happening, but it is, you know? So he has this kind of meta narration or something like that, that's going on. So let's see. I'm going to talk about, maybe I'll leave the sublime aside.
That's okay.
So this paragraph goes on and on and on about this sensation of gloominess, sadness, insufferable doom, unredeemed dreariness. iciness, sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought, which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. And he's like, what is it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher, right? So we have this guy who's just on horseback, he's passing this house, and he's pausing, and he's just like, why is it creeping me out so much? So we're already in, to me, what I would call the Gothic mode, like within a few sentences of this first paragraph, right? So this house is old, it's gray, the day in which he encounters it is autumn, it's evening, it's cloudy, right? So all of this gloominess of the setting is something that's associated with what I would consider the Gothic mode. So a kind of mode of literature that's happening in the early 19th century. It's associated with all this gloominess, and it's also associated with like old buildings and old things, whether they are actually old or they just look old. That is sort of like where the Gothic is set, and the Gothic is where creepy things can start to happen, where things that are unusual, things that are not natural, things that are not realistic might arise. So even before anything really weird happens, Poe is setting a scene here in which we are suspicious, right? Like, we think that, like, weird stuff might happen. And more than that, our narrator is, like, on edge. Like, he knows that, like, he's having some weird thoughts and some weird feelings, and so he's becoming a suspicious reader, I think, himself. Like, he knows that, like, weird things might happen, or that he's going to be overly suspicious or like overly sensitive to any kind of weird stuff that might happen.
Now, again, I may be prematurely inserting myself into this conversation, but our narrator doesn't just stumble upon this house. He's there with a purpose, right? So he has some mental preparation for...
Right. So why I'm pushed so hard on this first paragraph is nowhere in this first paragraph does he indicate that.
Right.
And so we are introduced to this house as though he's just a passerby on a horse who happens upon the house. And like, to me, that's so important because he's just setting this scene of gloom, and we don't have we have the personal of like he's telling us how he feels, but we have no history of the family. We have no idea who Usher is. We have no idea why this guy's there. Okay. So like he gives it to us as if he's just passing by. Okay. And then it's right in the very beginning of paragraph 2. And he says, "Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now propose to myself a sojourn of some weeks." And it's like, wait, what? Like, you're just passing this place that's totally creeping you out, and you're like, yeah, but I'm going to go stay for a couple weeks. Like, it seems odd, right? I wrote, ha, in the margin. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed, blah, 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 right? And so this is where he reveals, like, why he's there and what has brought him there, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, this just seems really important to me that he, like, delays giving us that information, right? Because he very much could have that could have been at the very beginning, right? But he didn't do that. But actually... Before we even get to that, I really like this scene at the very end of the first paragraph. All this stuff about how creepy the house is. And he says, I guess I can just read this. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression. And, acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling and gazed down, a tarn being a lake, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge and the ghastly tree stems and the vacant and eye-like windows. So those are some of the terms that he's used to describe the house already. So what he's doing here is he thinks that like he'll be less creeped out if he sees the house a little bit differently from a different angle. And so he's like, oh, there's this very calm, still lake that the house is right by. So if I look down and see the reflection of the house, maybe I'll calm down. And he looks down and he's just as creeped out. And so this is an image that comes back a few times later. The tarn ends up being very important. And then his memory of looking down into the tarn and like it not helping is something that he brings up again. So that's where we're at. And then he's like, by the way, I'm here for a reason. My old bro Usher really wanted to see me. So do you want to like? Do
you want to say why Usher requested his presence?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You should do that.
All right. Well, I'm not as familiar with the story as Lindsay is, but my recollection of it is that Roderick Usher I don't know why he selected his childhood friend.
Neither.
Maybe that's something we'll talk about. But Roderick has been overcome by both a physical and a mental malady, and requests his company. Is he trying to get over it, or is he worried that the end is near? Because he speaks often as if actions have been set in motion that will lead to his precipitous decline.
Yes.
So is he just there for temporary comfort? Is he there? What purpose is he there?
Well,
for?
I think his the purpose that he gives is something about like the happy mood that his friend might bring to him. That he might bring him some kind of happiness. By the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malady. That is our narrator's summary or paraphrase of the letter. But at the same time, the narrator points out that like he could not say no to this letter because the letter is so frantic. The letter is so. I think the handwriting is even kind of crazy. Like that, it's like he's.
Do we want to?
The MS gave evidence of nervous agitation.
Do we want to say anything about the malady in question?
Sure. Yeah. So we get that the malady is seems to be physical and mental, right? And he describes it as being in some way hereditary or a family evil. Is that what it's called? Something like that. Yeah. But maybe even before we get to the family evil or the particular malady that he has. We get this explanation of why our narrator is going to the house of Usher, and so we know that like his old friend lives there. His friend is very ill and has requested his presence, and that his friend is like pretty frantic about it, and like he couldn't really say no, and so he goes to the house. And then he goes on to explain a little bit, then the narrator goes on to explain a little bit about like how well he knows Usher and how long it's been since he's seen him and what he knows about the family, right?
Yeah.
And so he says they were very close as boys, they were intimate associates as boys, but that he actually hasn't seen him in a really long time.
He looks almost unrecognizable to him.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, later he looks unrecognizable. And so it's to us, it's like, I think to us it's a little bit weird that it's like, this is your best friend in the world, but like you haven't seen him in, I don't know, 15, 20 years. I'm not really sure how long. I take these people to be like adults, at least in their 20s. And so that seems odd. But our narrator does give this sort of background about the family that he knows.
And this is crazy.
Right. And so the family is well known in the area and is known for like some good things, is known for, munificent yet unobtrusive charity. They have produced many works of exalted art. And what else? In passionate devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more than to the orthodox and easily recognizable beauties of musical science. So they're a talented family, and they're a rich family, and they give a lot of money and stuff away. And they have this house that they've had for generations and generations, this like ancient house that has this gray sedge and the lurid tarn and the ghastly trees, I think. And it also has this one crack in it that he notices, that goes from the roof in a zigzag direction down to the ground, right? And so this house is as old as the family, and the narrator goes on to explain that the name House of Usher refers to both the family and to the house itself. That like the people in the area like not conflate, but like they use the term interchangeably to refer to the house and to the family. And furthermore, the family, what is it?
You've only spoken of the good things that they're known for.
Sure, I know. They have a deficiency, I think, right? In what is it? They don't have, what is the word? Collateral issue. Deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issue, which I love the term collateral issue, which means children, or like nieces and nephews. So the family has never deviated, right? The tree has never branched, I believe is what they say. And so there's always just been like one kid or whatever. And like there have been a few times when like maybe they've branched out, but it hasn't lasted. And so this family has always just been this like, one line, right? And they've always lived in this house. And let's see, undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name. And so that's part of the reason why, or that is the reason why House of Usher refers to both the family and to the house. I feel like
should we say anything about the current constitution of the House of Usher in terms of the individuals that make up
Sure.
So there's Roderick, right? And a little bit later on in the story, we'll be introduced to his twin sister, Madeline. And it's just them. It's just them. And it's not obvious that they're twins until later.
Yeah, do you want to go on about that?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that, before I would go into that, I think we should describe Roderick's condition a little bit more.
Okay.
Right? So, like, Roderick's condition is that it's one of, at least, where the physical and where the mental begins, or the physical ends and the mental begins. I mean, it's one of hypersensitivity, right? So, like, what I was able to gauge from it, he loves music. There are musical instruments throughout the entire house. He loves playing musical instruments, but he can only do it within a certain range so it doesn't hurt his ears. They're particularly sensitive. Sunlight seems to be an issue for him.
Food is a taste. He eats bland food.
Yeah, there's only a certain range of things that he can consume. And then I suppose this gives him over to great agony or whatever.
Right.
Like, just sickens him mentally.
Yeah, I don't know that that's, like, actually it's supposed to be, like, the source of his ill. I think that might be maybe more like an effect. I think these are symptoms. I didn't really take that to be, like, necessarily.
Well, that's interesting. We'll talk more about that. Yeah, we'll talk more about that, like, what his real condition is.
Right. Yeah.
So do we want to talk about Madeline?
Yeah. As long as I remember to come back to horror and terror and tone and stuff.
Sure.
Yeah. So go ahead.
So I'm trying to recall what I know of Madeline, but she's sort of, I don't. It doesn't seem like the narrator knows that Madeline exists, and then they cross paths. And does Roderick not reveal that she is very, very sick and that she's not long for this world, and that she has a very unique physical condition? I don't know how much is elaborated upon there, but he intimates that she's going to die soon, right? That's about as much as I can say about Madeline's condition at that particular time.
Okay, yeah. So our narrator, gets to the house and he sees his old buddy Roderick, and he, as Luke said, thinks that he looks so different that he's barely recognizable. And I think it's worth dwelling on what he looks like. I think I kind of skipped over how he describes the house as having, what is it? The vacant and eye-like windows that comes up like 2 or 3 times, that phrase in the first paragraph. And so when we get to actually seeing Usher, we see that he many times over is mentioned as being pallid, being wan, being cadaverous of complexions. He looks like he's dead.
Kind of reminded me of the Crypt Keeper because he had really diaphanous, wispy hair too.
Right, that's right. He has the arabesque of his hair. Yeah, but he does have an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison. So Usher's eyes are different than the rest of him. He looks stony and dead, but he has these eyes. But then it's vacant and eye-like windows of the house, right? But if we didn't already see a connection between the house and the person, it's this thing with eyeballs really made me think of that. And so Usher's pale complexion and want of moral energy, these things come up.
He often describes him as wan,
yeah,
which is a really great word that I don't hear very often. In
yeah. Oh, he said it was when. I don't know. I guess it's one of those things I don't say out loud, right? Because I always read it in literature. W-A-N, I just want to keep talking about setting. So kind of jumping around. But okay. Because I do want to talk a bit about the Gothic.
Please do.
So maybe I can just do that. Yeah. So all that stuff I was saying about setting at the beginning, dark autumn, creepy mood, right? All of that sort of puts us in the Gothic mode. He even mentions the idea of the sublime, and the sublime is something that we also associate with the Gothic. The sublime being an experience, I guess, that a person has in the presence of something much greater than themselves. That thing is usually nature. That thing is usually a mountain or a enormous storm or something like that, some sort of show of nature's power that is just so radically other than the human. And he talks about expecting the sublime in the first section and not getting it, I think, is something that happens. And so that feeling of terror and of awe is something that's associated with the sublime. the Gothic is a mode that I think I was saying earlier, right, is this sort of creepy mood, and also oftentimes associated with old things, and particularly with things that are sort of from the Middle Ages, or like look like they might be from the Middle Ages. So like castles, and that kind of thing. That's where a lot of like Gothic tales happen. And so this house of Usher has a Gothic archway when you enter, and it has these windows that are like long and skinny and let in very little light. That also is very much like associated with like Gothic architecture, right? So like the word Gothic is actually used, but like so many of the descriptions of this house, like it has this crazy crypt situation. You can like between the walls.
Yeah, we gotta get to that.
And it's also very, very large. Like when our narrator Roderick, our narrator, is going in, it's like he's taken through chamber after chamber after chamber, and there's like tapestries on the walls and like all of this kind of like heraldry stuff, like before he actually gets into Roderick's apartment, right? So it's like he's like a medieval knight or something, I don't know, like being like received by a king or whatever. And so all of that is like, and at this time, like people are used to reading Gothic literature, so it's like these things are like signifiers of like what mode we're in. So like that, all that I'm pushing on that stuff at the very beginning is like about like readers are going to get like what kind of story this is from like the first couple sentences. Something else I want to point out, I'm not really sure where this goes, is that when he's walking through the house, when he's being taken in by like a butler person and he sees all these things on the walls, he says they're phantasmagoric and stuff, like they're creeping him out. But he also says that they're familiar. Like, so our narrator, I mean, and they grew up together, right? So, like, we get that the Usher family is very well off, but, like, so is our narrator. Like, I think that's, I don't really know what to do with that, but it's, like, he is also a well-off guy who is, like, used to these kinds of things. Like, he's not, like, normally, like, being in a house this large would, like, not be unusual for him. So, like, that it is creeping him out. Maybe, maybe there's something there that, like, it's, any of us going to a castle, right, would be, like, uncomfortable, but, like, this guy's, like, used to this kind of life and is still, like, feels very strange.
We'll get a little bit deeper into the story. There seem to be all these sort of atmospheric things that happen that are blamed on some environmental factors in relation to the lake and stuff like that. But, we can see that there might be something supernatural occurring here.
So we're sort of set up to be on edge about that and sort of suspicious about that. And our narrator, as I was saying, he's aware that he's being affected by this physical space, and that he is in this mood. And he pretty early on reflects back on what he calls his childish experiment, which was like looking down into the tarn to see if he could like calm down a little bit if he saw the house in reflection. And he says that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down within the tarn, had been to deepen the first singular impression, that being the feeling of melancholy and darkness. There can be no doubt that the consciousness of the rapid increase of my superstition, for why should I not so term it, served mainly to accelerate the increase itself. Such I have long known as the paradoxical law of all sentiments having terror as their basis. So this narrator is like, he knows he's being superstitious. Like, he uses that word. Like, he knows this is irrational. But nevertheless, he's like, what happens when you're scared is that you just get more scared. Your awareness is heightened, and you become suspicious of everything around you, and you take things that otherwise in a different mood, in a different kind of affective state, you wouldn't notice as creepy, and you integrate them into you read them as part of the horror or the terror that you're experiencing, right? So he's giving us a sense of like how fear works. But he's also giving us a sense of how, like, reading a text like this works, right? So, like, this whole thing about, like, we're ready for something crazy to happen. Like, that's what he's talking about here, I think, right? Is that like, he's in that heightened state as a narrator. We're certainly going to see that Usher's in a heightened state like that. And, like, we as readers are maybe also kind of, like, brought along into that, right? And this might also raise a few questions about, like, what is going on with our narrator? Like, is he reliable if he's in this heightened state where everything is going to make him scared? But if he has the awareness, at the same time, he has the awareness to like narrate that, to like explain that to us, and so like he's actually quite like a reader, quite a critic, you know, that he's able to like tell us like this theory of what all sentiments having terror as their basis.
Yeah, the only time he ever really breaks down in lucidity is when he's quoting Roderick.
Right.
Because Roderick is very physically and mentally disturbed.
Right. And, you know, he has the distance of time or whatever, you know, to look back on this. But, yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting narratorial position. Right. So he is in the house. He meets Roderick, who is pale and has interesting eyes and thin, wispy hair. Roderick explains to him this thing about his heightened sensitivity to in all of his senses, right? But he also, Roderick himself talks about his own fear.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah. And so a few times later in the text, Roderick refers to himself, or no, maybe the narrator refers to him as hypochondriac.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so this,
multiple times.
Yes,
yeah.
So this I take as like this thing that ends in fear. I take that section as being like the explanation of that, or like the inspiration for that, I guess.
So that his illness isn't really real.
Well, I think that there might be, much like our narrator who has this like heightened sense of suspicion, this house is creepy. This house is old. Like we will see there are reasons why this house is like strange, right? But that little seed of that like makes this so much bigger for our narrator, and that's basically what I take to be going on with Roderick, is that like he expects to die, and so he will, and like he expects for crazy things to happen, and so they do, like, or like, you know, or like that they, you know what I'm saying, like that like actually makes things come into being necessarily, but like the whole reading and representation
There's
of
like
them
a really
is like, so let's see. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger, except in its absolute effect, in terror. In this unnerved, in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with the grim phantasm, fear. So he also is like scared of something, you know?
Right.
And I think on first reading, I take that to be like, oh, well, he's like mentally disturbed and he's just scared. But then it's like, wait, well, maybe there's like a chicken egg thing here or something like that, right? That like maybe that's like some sort of cause of, whatever is getting him down. Right before this, right, we have this constitutional and family evil. That's what Roderick Usher explains to our narrator is going on with him. So we never get a name for what's happening with him. I guess we get hypochondria a little bit later. But he's physically ill. He's mentally ill. There's something in the family. We don't really know.
It seems interesting to me, at least what I picked up on when I was reading this, that Roderick's symptoms, as imaginary as they may be, are described in greater detail than Madeline's.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I don't really recall like what Madeline's symptoms were. All I know is that like doctors are interested in her, and then Roderick lets us know that at some point during this whole sojourn of our narrator, that Madeline passes. Mm-hmm. And it's not a big to-do. She just kind of dies. But I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here. Like, Roderick doesn't want to bury her in a cemetery. And you made mention to the vaults and the unique sort of arrangement of this house or whatever, that they ultimately inter her into some sort of vault in the wall to keep her away from the physicians.
So why don't you back up a little bit and introduce Madeline to us? Like, how do we first encounter her?
I don't have a lot to say. She seems pretty unremarkable to me.
Do you remember how we first encounter her? Like,
no,
in the
I
text?
don't really. Okay, that's about all I've got.
So yeah, so our the narrator Roderick mentions her. And this is also interesting, right? Because it's like if they're childhood friends, like it's strange that our narrator wouldn't know about Roderick's sister, right? Like already
strange, yeah.
Going on, and we find out later they're twins too. So like definitely, like seems like he would know that she exists. But you know, as I was telling Luke off camera, we are not in a realist text, so we are suspending disbelief for many reasons as we read the story. What was I going to say?
You were going to say, like, when
he mentions, I believe what happens is that Roderick Usher mentions his sister, and right as he's mentioning her, she walks by, and our narrator sees her. And she also looks pale, and our narrator kind of shudders, like he gets this feeling of, like, eeriness from her. And when he looks to Roderick Usher to kind of, like, see what his reaction is. And so Roderick Usher has already said, like, Madeline, my sister, she's ill. the doctors know what to do with her. So which means that she's going to die soon. And they're just kind of counting down the days.
But it's an exceptional illness. Like, it's a very unusual one that they can't really name or anything like that.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I don't know that he just says it's like, I think that they just say, right, that like she can't, the doctors can't do anything. Yeah. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus afflicted him could be traced to the more natural and far more palpable origin, to the severe and long-continued illness, indeed the evidently approaching dissolution of a tenderly beloved sister. I love that, the dissolution of a person. Right? His sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said, with a bitterness which I can never forget, would leave him the hopeless and the frail, the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so was she called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed her retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly the countenance of the brother, but he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more than ordinary wanness had overspread the emaciated fingers through which trickled many passionate tears. So he gets a glimpse of Madeline. She apparently does not see him. He looks to Usher for Usher's response, a reaction to her presence, and Usher is covering his eyes and crying.
Well, we don't really know why.
We don't know. Yeah, we don't know why. So that's...
You would assume that it might be some grief in the anticipation of her demise.
Yeah,
her dissolution.
Dissolution. Yeah. So I mean, I think that would be like what the obvious reading is, that like they've been locked up in this house, not locked up, but they have not left this house in a very long time. We learned earlier Usher hasn't left the house in years. Madeline is his only companion, and we see him crying. But we also get the sense of like, okay, so we have this brother and sister who are living in this house, and this family that has this line hasn't deviated, and so we're starting to be like, is there incest going on here, right? Even before we have the brother and sister, when we have this line of this house that hasn't deviated for generations and generations, like that certainly suggests like that there's something incestuous going on, or that there's like a long family history of incest, in fact.
Yeah, his sole companion for many, many years, right?
Right. Yeah, and in the literature of this time, I think in 19th century America, like there is a lot of, in 18th century too, there's a lot of literature of incest. A lot of times it's cross-class incest, and so... people who are have affairs or whatever with like servants or with poor people or whatever, and it like turns out that person is actually their illegitimate child or their illegitimate sibling or something like that. But this is like known sort of brother, the suggestion of like known brother sister incest. Which is something about class consciousness or about I don't know, like because these are obviously like the highest classes. So there's something about that. But there's also maybe something here about like England and America. Like I am assuming this is set in England. I mean, it's an American text, but like to have a house that's this old, I'm not really sure that could be in the United States. So when we talk about the Gothic, that's usually seen as like a European, originating in Europe, being a European form, because there are these old Gothic buildings and medieval castles and stuff from which this stuff can arise, or where these things can be set. But in the United States, right, since no one cares about indigenous culture, like there's not like anything that's like old enough to be Gothic. Like there aren't any old castles or anything like that, because like nothing was built right on the continent by Europeans until like the 1600s. And so the Gothic has a bit of a problem like when it comes over from England to the United States, or from Europe to the United States. Like it has to kind of morph, it has to change, it has to find different sites. And so I take Usher to be set in England. Which doesn't mean it's not an American text, it's not commenting on America in some way, but like it seems like that's probably where it is. And so I don't. Anyway, so the incest possibility, I wonder if it's like something about like, what's the word? Creolization, like coming, people who came to the United States. Or not to the United States, to the colonies, right? There was this idea that like once the children of colonists were born, they were different somehow. Like those were the Americans, like the Creolized, like the ones born in the new place, right? So Creolization not necessarily meaning like mixture, but meaning like the children of the colonists. And so there's supposed to be some kind of change. There's supposed to be something that makes Americans different than people in Europe, right? But this seems to be about like something about like not changing, right? About like not getting outside of something. And so I wonder if there's some kind of something there about like the upper classes in the United States or something like that, like not like recreating something in Europe that they weren't supposed to recreate. I don't know. I don't have a good sense of like what this might mean like overall thematically. What else? Keep going.
So we need to talk about
Yep.
what ultimately happens to Madeline, Roderick, and our narrator.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about that a little bit?
Go ahead.
All right. So they inter her in the wall, essentially, right? So she's put in this vault, right?
So Roderick just sort of announces casually that she's died. It's like a little by the by.
Yeah.
Madeline's dead. We got to deal with it. So
And
that in itself is odd, but
yeah, it is sort of odd. And he wants to put her in the wall rather than the graveyard. So for a fortnight, we have to do this. And our narrator is not interested in questioning him too much. Like, he doesn't want to cause him any sort of extra grief, so he just goes along with it. And it seems like to me like a pretty complicated mechanism for burying someone and for someone to be able to get out of, right? And so Roderick and our narrator, like, he tries to comfort him. One of the things that he does is he brings out a romance novel, not a romance novel, Sir Lancelot something or other, right?
Yeah.
Which I believe has got to be significant on some level. I didn't have time to research it at all, but in order to make Roderick feel better, the narrator reads aloud to him.
yeah, I would want to just back up a little bit.
Sure. Okay.
And talk about the act of putting her into the vault.
Yeah, go for it.
So Roderick Usher announces, just kind of casually, that Madeline has passed, and he explains that he wants to inter her in the walls of the house for a fortnight. I think the implication there is like before taking her to a family plot. The family plot being, I believe, remote and exposed, I think is what it is, and that so the family plot is too remote and too exposed, is combined with what is it? Certain unobtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of her medical men in the remote and exposed position of the situation of the burial ground. So this is the worldly reason that Roderick Usher gives for putting her in the wall, and it's one that our narrator feels he cannot or should not question. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person whom I met upon the staircase on the day of my arrival at the house, I had no desire to oppose what I regarded as as at best but a harmless and by no means an unnatural precaution. So this thing about the obtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of her medical men, the doctors were not able to help her, right? The doctors had kind of given up with Madeline. They could not figure out what was going on with her, and so she dies. And so I take this to mean that like that is that combined with the exposed position of the family burial ground, the doctors might want to dig up her grave, and that like the family can't have that, like obviously. And so they're going to inter her in the walls as like a
because
and
they
like
might
lock
want to
her.
do like some sort of autopsy or something like that on her.
That's like what I take it to be, that like she's a medical oddity, or that they might want to
which would feed into stuff.
And so that she's some kind of medical oddity. And so like when I read that, like I think my first reading is like that there's something like, I mean, I guess that they wanted to do like experiments on her or something, or on her body. But we, as things go on, I think we can kind of like look back to that moment as foreshadowing of like any number of interpretations. But I want to point to that as
that's good.
As
that's
like
good.
Something that might be helpful to us.
Yeah. And
so they go to put her in the wall, and our narrator is just like helping his buddy out, putting his sister in the wall of the house, like you do. And this is the temporary entombment, right? So small, damp, entirely without means of admission for light, lying at great depth. Oh, we didn't really talk that much about the music and the art.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. No,
it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Like, by the way, you know, what's interesting? I don't know if you wanted to say anything about the French lyric that starts this all off.
I actually like forget who it is and all of that. Yeah. I know there's like a word that he changed that made it yours. It made it his instead of mine.
Something about the lute hangs.
Yeah. Oh, right. The lute. The lute being untouched or something. Yeah. I don't remember it. So,
but yeah, Roderick's a very good guitar player, even though within the limited range that he can play, and that's one of the things they do is that he sings a song while they're.
Yeah. So he sings a song that's like. You know, we get all the lyrics of the song.
There's lots of music throughout this whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can clearly see that the song is like in some way about the House of Usher. What I was actually going to point to is the painting that Usher does.
Oh, okay.
Of this room that is clearly the vault. Like the room is like the painting is just like I don't know. He made this because we get it earlier in the story, and so it's like I don't know. Usher did this painting of a creepy room, and then later when we go into the vault, it's the painting. Like it's pretty clearly the painting. Yeah. So. You just have to trust me on that. And so, as I was just reading, like, describing the vault here, I was, like, reminded of that. So this vault, I don't know if vault's the right word, but the vault in which we placed it, it's the coffin. Well, it was small, damp, and entirely without means of admission for light, lying at great depth, immediately beneath that portion of the building in which was my own sleeping apartment. So now they're putting Madeline's body like beneath where our narrator is sleeping, right? It has been used apparently in remote feudal times. So I like circled feudal because that's like
old
medieval, yeah. For the worst purposes of a dungeon keep, and in later days as a place of deposit for powder or some other highly combustible substance, as a portion of its floor, blah blah. So it ends up we find out that it's coated in copper. I think, because copper is like not combustible or something like that, I assume. And so it's like very protected. And the door has an immense weight. It's made of iron.
Yeah.
You know, all the stuff.
She's not getting out of there.
Yeah. So
she is buried.
Having deposited our mournful burden upon the trestles in the region of horror. We partially turned aside, yet unscrewed the lid of the coffin. So imagine they like take this thing into this room that's like super secure, and they like unscrew the lid of the coffin to look at her while they're in this like dungeon area. And her face has like revived a little bit, like she's got rosy cheeks.
And the narrator speaks about the sort of ironic smile that death can put on someone's face.
Right.
They can to give sort of a lifelike appearance or something like that.
The mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip, which is so terrible in death, right? So her malady was a strictly cataleptical in character. I'm not sure where that fits in with any of our possible readings.
What is cataleptic?
Cataleptic?
Like catatonic?
No. It's cataleptic is like when your muscles kind of like atrophy. So if a person is like stuck in a crazy position, they're cataleptic. So like sometimes people with Parkinson's like will have like they won't die of it, but it's like they will have catalepsy. So if like you're like you know, just in this like rigid position with some limb or something like that. I think that's what catalepsy is. And so like sometimes it'll be like the whole body will be in some like bizarro, you know, position. And I don't know what causes it. But it seems that she has it. I think, we've catalepsy or cataleptic like comes up a couple times. I think all in relation to her. Okay. So she's in the dungeon, or the crypt. And then we have, as Luke said, I think it says 7 or 8 days go by. During all of this time, our narrator's starting to feel a little bit weird. And then at night 7 or night 8, there's a storm. There's a full moon. And there's a storm raging outside. And he wakes up and he knows he's not going to get back to sleep. Like he's just feeling like real creeped out. And so he puts his clothes on. And Usher comes in, I think, to his room. And Usher is also very worked up. And they like look out the window. And like the storm is raging and like the windows are like making a lot of noise, right? And they look down and it's like the tarn is glowing. So there's this like weirdness about like what's going on at the house. And
And Usher says something along the lines when all these things are happening, he's like, you mustn't see it, right?
Right.
Like, these are just like electromagnetic effects that are going on.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and we learned earlier too that Usher like believes in like what is it, like the vibrancy of vegetable life or whatever. Like he kind of believes his house is alive.
Yeah.
Like is one, or like he believes that like specifically in reference to his house. So he has this whole idea that like house is a living thing. So to calm Usher down, our narrator reads a romance. And so I take it to actually be not a romantic novel, but to be like a romance as in like from the medieval era. So like a kind of like knights and like romance being a like pre-novelistic kind of like thing.
Do you know anything about this particular book, David? I think it's significant because
I'm sure it is. Everything is significant.
Yeah. It's Sir Lancelot or something like that, and apparently, and he gives us a little bit of the story too. And I just like, man, there's got to be a reason for why.
There's a reason for every single word in the story.
Yeah.
So like, yes, there's a reason. I just don't know it. Yeah.
I think it involves, if I recall correctly, it involves something about like a knight like bashing a dragon over the head with like a mace or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, he doesn't expect a dragon, but he gets a dragon. Like he like expects to get. I forget where he's going. I think it's just like a. Like a peasant or something like that. And when he knocks down the door, there's a dragon there.
I don't know. It's very
Ethelred, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean that it's this medieval romance. Like I guess is sort of like not all I took. You know, I'm looking at it as like, oh right, we have another like medieval thing here, right? You know, we have this dungeon that seems to come from that time. This house has these Gothic windows, and then like what are we reading? We're reading a medieval romance. Like we're not reading short stories that were recently published, or you know, so. If this is presumably set in its present, which is 1839, like that seemed, interesting. That like in medieval romances, all kinds of strange things happen, like dragons, and so like it seems like a medieval romance is not like the thing that would calm you down, right, or potentially not. Right, so he's reading this, and as he's reading it, he the story has.
This is great.
Yeah, I can do it.
Oh, I don't know if I know it right, but as he's reading it. Right, so like I love Roderick reading it, or the narrator reading it aloud, but I got the impression that when the narrator was reading it, that Roderick was hearing sound effects and things like that.
The narrator's hearing sound effects.
Is the narrator hearing the sound effects? Or why don't you clarify?
Yeah.
Because I had a little trouble with who was hearing what at that point.
Yeah, so the narrator is reading the story to Roderick Usher out loud, I think, and as he's reading it, when like a sonic thing happens in the story, he thinks he hears it. And so the first thing happens and he's like, that was really weird, but I must just be imagining it.
Yes.
I'm hyper aware tonight. And then the next thing happens and he's like, okay, this is getting really creepy. And he kind of looks to Usher and is like trying to figure out if he hears it too. And when I think the third one happens, Usher turns to him and is like, yes, I heard it. And Usher kind of has a meltdown.
Well, there's like this bleeding between the text and their reality, right? Okay. Kind of, yeah.
Yeah. And so the like, it's like the knight beating the mace on the door, and then like the I think the dragon screeches or somebody screeches or something like that. And I think these are these sounds that they're hearing. And so, let's see. Usher kind of knows what the narrator is thinking. Like he knows that the narrator is wondering if Usher is hearing it. And so, let's see.
So Roderick is anticipating the narrator putting it all together.
It seems like it.
Yeah. And then he makes a confession.
Yeah.
Roderick is about to make a confession.
Yeah. So, and this is like, right, centered around the, not centered around, but inspired by this thing with hearing the sounds that are happening in the story, hearing them in real life, right? Not hear it? Yes, I hear it and have heard it long, many minutes, many hours, many days have I heard it. Yet I dared not, oh, pity me, miserable wretch that I am. I dared not speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Said I not that my senses were acute? I now tell you that I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow coffin. I heard them many, many, many days ago, yet I dared not to speak. And now tonight, Ethelred, ha! The breaking of the hermit's door, and the death cry of the dragon, and the clangor of the shield, say, rather, the rending of her coffin, and the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the coppered archway of the vault. So he has known, like, since, I guess, like, the day they put her in the tomb, that she was actually alive, and that she has been trying to get out, and he, with his heightened senses, has been hearing her struggle.
Right.
And then this is the night when it has become so loud, I guess, that it's becoming clear. And then she actually gets out of the tomb, and she comes to the door of the chamber that they're in, right? Is she not hurrying to upbraid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footstep on the stair? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet and shrieked out his syllables as if in the effort he were giving up his soul. Madman! I tell you that she now stands without the door. Interesting that Usher is calling our narrator Madman, I think. Oh. So, right? Yeah. Which is interesting. So, door flies open, is that right? And Lady Madeline of Usher comes in. There was blood upon her white robes and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold, then, with a low moaning cry, fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies bore him to the floor a corpse and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated.
So how did that was the thing that intrigued me. She bore him to the floor a corpse, or whatever that expression is. So she kills him in the... Well, we don't know that she kills him?
Well, she kills him like he...
They both collapse, and dead on the ground.
Correct. Right? She kills him in the sense that he's scared to death by her.
Oh.
I don't think she, like, stabs him, kills him, or anything like that.
Yeah, I was wondering how exactly she he dies.
He's a victim of the terrors he had anticipated.
Oh.
Right? And so this idea of... that thing I was pointing to earlier about the hypochondria and how he's, like, expecting the great phantasm fear. Like, he's, like, that, like, nothing bothers him but like the possible effect of it or something, whatever it was. Like, so this I take to be that he's like so freaked out by the situation that he actually, I mean, he's obviously in a fragile state, and then so that's
okay, I see.
Though I mean, like what he's reading into this is right, like, will she not upbraid me for my haste? Like, he thinks that she's coming to get him in some
because we have to ask
potentially murderous way, I think.
Yeah,
right?
We're not even asking the question right now, and we'll discuss it here in a second. Like, what if he was able to detect that she was alive in the tomb? Why he didn't
go get her?
Why he didn't save her?
Yeah. So I don't know the answer to, like, I just taught this recently to a group of students, and I don't, like, I opened it up to them, like, does he put her in the tomb alive on purpose, or is it an innocent mistake? And
either
like,
way,
how much does he know about what? Yeah.
Either way, at some point he incurs culpability for it. Mm-hmm. Right. But yeah, it is an interesting question about his original intentions.
Right.
It seems like he may have known more than he let on, if what you're saying is true about him having, like, sort of artistically rendered the tomb way in advance.
Yeah, I mean, he hasn't artistically rendered, like, the coffin, but he's artistically rendered, like, the room.
Yeah.
Like the weird dungeon.
That he's fixated on it,
space.
almost as part of a plan.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess, I mean, at this point now we can, so this happens. We're basically in the story, right? So this happens. The two collapse to the floor. The brother and sister are dead in each other's arms, basically. Kind of hot. And, from that chamber and from that mansion, I fled aghast. So our narrator is like, I am out of here. And he gets on his horse and he leaves, and there's still the storm raging outside. It's still a full moon. It is a dark and stormy night. Like, this is, like, where some of that stuff comes from, right? The idea that, like, that's when ghost stories happen. So he gets on his horse and he leaves, and he has to cross this, like, causeway over the tarn. And there's some sound, I think, that happens that, like, makes him look back. And so he looks back, and he sees the moon, and like so there's that crack in the house.
Blood moon.
The blood moon, yeah, that's been there's this crack that's he mentioned earlier in the house, and he comes back to it again, and he sees a little bit of the moon through the crack in the house, I think, and then he sees the crack just open, and the house collapses into the tarn, and then there's the moon like left where the house was absent. So that is the fall of the House of Usher, is that the house actually falls apart on this night.
So as these individuals have dissolved, so has the entire family ancestry. Like it's terminated. It is done.
It is done. Yeah. So these two, this brother and sister have died together. They've collapsed to the ground. They've fallen. This house has fallen apart. So if we come back to this idea that the House of Usher is is at once the family and the house, that those things are in some way like, I don't know, mutually reinforcing or something like that. There's more than just a coincidental relationship between them. There seems to actually be some kind of like weird tie between them.
Did you ever get struck by the idea that the house may have, because they have these tombs within the house, that actually the house may have been composed of the ancestors? Yeah. Like
yeah, no, I think that's some of the idea is that like that the house is like
some of its basic bricks are like people.
Yeah, no, that it physically contains and that its basic bricks are people, but also that like its structural flaws, right? Like this crack, and it's got fungi growing on it and whatnot. Like its structural problems are also the structural problems of the family, right? Which would seem to be incest in this case, right? And there's something when he's describing it earlier. There's something weird about like it looking old but still being strong, or like something like that. I forgot.
So maybe we should provide some interpretation. Yeah. Like I think you did an absolutely beautiful explication of it, and I mean. As far as the text goes, and I think it'll be really, really helpful to a lot of individuals. But you and I have sort of batted around some interpretive lenses, and we've hinted at one of them already. Mm-hmm. How do you want to do this? Do you
go for it? Yeah.
You've got yours, and
so, yeah, I think like I guess what I do want to point out in the sense that this is a lesson on literature, right? Like. It's not like I've just explained it and now you're interpreting, right? Like we've been interpreting the whole time, right? Like all acts of reading are interpretive, and pointing out like the ways in which like some of these things earlier are foreshadowing of what comes later. Pointing out that like this moment about like why they're putting her in the like earthly reason or whatever why they're putting her in the wall, that might be foreshadowing of something else. All this stuff with mood and like figuring it into the Gothic, like all that stuff is interpretation.
Yes, totally.
Because like without any of that, right, you can still read this and it's just like a really creepy story, and that's all. But that's also a valid interpretation, right? Like some of its goals might be to scare, or to create scary horror or terrorist events or whatever. Go on.
Yeah. So all right. So the one you sort of mentioned already was the incestuous nature of this thing. I'm trying to think about like when I was sort of playing around with this idea of what is really going on here. Is that I'm thinking on the fly now. I wish I'd prepared a few more notes, but that the idea is that there has been, and I think we've addressed it throughout our conversation already, right? Mm-hmm. Is that this fatal flaw in the family is that there's like incest has been going on and on and on, and that they've as the result of inbreeding, developed these sicknesses that are somewhat inexplicable, either as hypochondriasis or hypersensitivity or whatever Madeline has going on as a creator, as a medical oddity.
Usher's also cataleptic, I realized too, like at that, or that he describes Usher as cataleptic. At that moment before he has a meltdown.
Well, I think the interesting thing would be is that what's going on with Madeline. Let's say like she actually. If we are reading it like a real, I mean, if we are to read it realist or non-realist or something like that,
realism doesn't really exist at this time.
I know, but I'm just trying. I'm trying to get inside Poe's mind a little bit or something like that. Yeah, like
realism is like after.
Yeah,
Poe, so.
If we let's say Roderick was scheming to murder Madeline in some way. May he have done some unspeakable sin? Like, may he have, like, maybe they had maybe they had conceived a child or something like that, and, like, he needed to bring this to a close somehow. And the fact that, like, she comes back and has her sort of revenge and is bloody in some way, like, maybe that plays into something nefarious that's going on there a little bit. I don't know if I have a lot to say about it, but I think that's something to consider.
Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't thought about like murder and it being a result of, or an effect or whatever of incest. But that makes sense. I mean, no, yeah, that's plausible.
And maybe the blood on her clothes has something to do with a pregnancy not brought to term, or something like that, because as the result of this inbreeding or something like that. So that was,
yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
I don't know, something along those lines.
Yeah. So what would the idea there is that like she has that she's had an abortion. No, not that she's had an abortion that has killed her.
No,
but that
maybe a miscarriage as a result of the inbreeding.
Okay. Yeah.
And
so then why are the doctors then the doctors are interested in her because everybody's inbred and so they might want to like look at what's the deal is or whatever.
Yeah, whatever kind of mutations would happen as a result of that.
Yeah. I mean, interesting. Yeah.
I don't know. It's just a theory. I think what's more interesting is, and you have an interpretation that you like, and I think you should share it. But I think what's more interesting is how they could potentially come together.
I actually don't really like the vampire one that much. But like, because it's not that I don't like it. It's just I don't know enough about vampires and literature and stuff to really make a case for it. But I mean, I'm definitely more interested in just like talking about the incest one because I'm always interested. I'm always interested.
Well, then feel free go on the incest thing more.
Oh, I mean, I guess I just mean like I just don't want to say that like the vampire one's my favorite because it's not. Like the incest is what I want, is like what I'm most interested in talking about because I'm actually like very interested in incest in American literature more broadly for like hundreds of years. And like, what all that might mean for American identity and all that kind of stuff. But there is, this possibility that like there's something supernatural about this family or about Madeline in particular. And so like the idea that the doctors are interested in like digging up her body to me seemed like it could be that she's a medical oddity, but being a medical oddity could also be like in some way being supernatural or something like that. And so I think the implication there being that she might be a vampire. Luke has this very interesting reading of vampirism and incest as being related, which I guess makes a lot of sense, right? Because one of the things vampires are doing is like not getting outside of what they're supposed to get outside of, right? Like they're almost like cannibals. Like they're not eating other things, they're like dining on people, so they're like staying within the species in a way that is taboo, I guess.
And I think the other thing is I don't know if it's Madeline alone that is a vampire, given Roderick's hypersensitivity to light, which is a characteristic that we do see in vampirism or whatever. I thought that maybe they both might be vampires. And the interesting thing is I did just a very cursory search of vampirism. It is, and it seems like vampires have proclivities towards, at least in the tradition. It's not like I was telling Lindsay over dinner, like my understanding of vampires is like kind of cartoonish. Like I think of Count Chocula and the Count from Sesame Street. So they're not very frightening creatures to me. But as a little bit of research I do, I mean, they go back like centuries, like this trope of the vampire. And oftentimes like these are the most cursed wretches that have committed sins that are like unpardonable in the eyes of God or something like that. And so they're these cursed creatures, and the story goes they have proclivities towards pedophilia and pedophilia mixed with incest and stuff like that. And so maybe both readings could be synthesized that they are vampires who are simultaneously engaging in incestry. I think that's a more robust, integrative, comprehensive thing. But I mean, obviously we're talking about 3 different views. There are probably a million different ways to read this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, I think that's great. Because it seems to be it covers a lot of the text. Like it integrates, I think, like a lot of the kind of clues or like details that we have. Something that people point to in Poe A lot is like what they call the totality of his stories, and that's what I mean by like every single word here matters, is that every little detail here adds up to something. So like the tarn is important, and like, the reflection, and
it was interesting when
the
you
work of
mentioned
art that he does is, you know, the painting that he makes and comes up later. Like
when you mentioned the sublime, you know, something we didn't talk about, like the sublime. You were talking about nature.
Yeah.
The tarn itself might be something that's sublime. And the other thing that is frequently, well, maybe not. We'll see. Okay, I'm just putting it out there as a candidate. Something else that is often sublime, on very rare occasions, we can think of individuals as sublime. Like, there's something like Hitler, right? Like, there's something that is just like, he inspires such like horror and awe at the same time, because he's like this infamous person who could just annihilate you or something like that. There is, on occasion, the individuals can come to represent the sublime. And I wonder if these vampiric sort of characters can have the sublime aspect to it, since they're monsters, and Hitler was a monster. I don't know if there's any similarity there in the discussion of the sublime and how it can be applied to
I have nothing to offer on that as far as the discussion of the sublime. You know, like I haven't this is, you know, pretty far out of my area, but I feel like when I talk about the sublime, it's usually like, you know, a thunderstorm on the top of the Alps or whatever.
Almost always is the sublime talked about that, but on very rare, I'm saying very rare instances, we can maybe apply it to individuals.
I mean, so make the case for it. You don't have to ask me about it. You know?
Well, like I mean, okay, like if you talk about like a storm going across the mountain, right? It's just like kind of wondrous thing, but you also know that it could totally destroy you, right? It's not just like, it's not a beautiful, like majestic thing. It's like this thing that has the power to totally annihilate you. And certain people can come to have that power too. So, and vampires, they suck the life out of people. Like they destroy people, they annihilate people.
So the our narrator here is like experiencing the sublime.
He might be in the presence of these monsters. Why he has to, I'm just...
but yeah, I'm trying to think of, like, if he... Because he's certainly, like... Yeah. I guess I could go either way, and, like, whether or not he's, like, actually experiencing the sublime, right? Because he's, like, so together and is always able to narrate, is to explain his feelings to us, you know? But that's also in the past, and, like, and the feelings that he is explaining are feelings of horror and feelings of terror.
I mean,
which is, like, what... If you are... you know, if you are in the presence of the sublime, you are terrified. That is like what you're supposed to be. That's like a sign that you're in the presence of the sublime, right? As if you're experiencing terror. So I mean, I guess like, that does seem to be part of the Gothic. It seems to make sense. I have never thought about it as like the historical figure, you know, inspiring the sublime. But like, since terror is like a thing we associate with the Gothic and is something that, you know, and comes out of the sublime, like these things are all like, you know, sort of siblings or whatever. What else was I going to say? Something that I feel like I tend to trot out when talking about Poe and Hawthorne, and these like really amazing short story writers of the early 19th century, is Poe wrote this thing in a review of Twice Told Tales, which is the collection of Hawthorne's stories in 1842.
Young Goodman Brown is in that collection.
Twice Told Tales? Yeah, probably. So I'm just going to read this briefly. We allude to the short prose narrative requiring from a half hour to 1 or 2 hours in its perusal. The ordinary novel is objectionable from its length for reasons already stated in substance. As it cannot be read at one sitting, it deprives itself, of course, of the immense force derivable from totality. Worldly interests intervening during the pauses of perusal modify, annul, or counteract, in a greater or less degree, the impressions of the book. But simple cessation in reading would, of itself, be sufficient to destroy the true unity. In the brief tale, however, the author is enabled to carry out the fullness of his intention, be it what it may. During the hour of perusal, the soul of the reader is at the writer's control. There are no external or extrinsic influences resulting from weariness or interruption. So Poe's just making the case for like the power of the tale or the short story because in its power, it so much derives from how you read it start to finish in one sitting. So I just really like that. I'm thinking about how I was like, could you read a few paragraphs and you read the whole thing?
Yeah, I did. I couldn't stop.
Right.
I could.
And like I don't know. There's all kinds of like kids these days with all their distractions kinds of readings of that, right? Because so much of this is about attention and like the story just like. You're totally absorbed in it, and like you're at the mercy of the writer. The writer has you, because you're like so focused, and there's no like interruptions. Like that, if you were to stop and like the world were to intervene when you came back to it, like something would be lost, And so like I think like in this idea of totality, right, of every detail, like adds up to something. Like it's just something that Poe does so well.
He's really incredible. I'm really glad that we did this text because like my exposure to Poe was like as a child to be like scared, and I really didn't think he had more to offer than that.
Oh, interesting.
And like,
yeah.
and now that I've taken this up as an adult, like it was something I always like read around Halloween time or something like that, or had my librarian read to me or whatever, and I would get like really freaked out. But now that I've been able to do it as an adult with someone who has your expertise, like my estimation of Poe is like gone through the roof.
He's definitely looked at as like an early, like that he's like thinking psychology before there's like terms for a lot of this stuff, or before there's like even concepts for a lot of what's like going on in the mind, like there's like readings of this as being about split personality and about the subconscious and all these kinds of things that like weren't actual things in 1839. So we should do, or you should read the Purloined Letter. That's something that like Lacan takes up later and stuff. So yeah.
Never get to it. All right. Did you want to say anything else? Thank you so much for listening. You can find this on the Noetic app for your Droid and iPhone devices. And thank you, Lindsay O'Connor, for being a part of this. That was awesome. All right. See you.